Hello, today I'm joined by Clara Mattei. She is an assistant professor in the economics department of the New School for Social Research in New York. Professor Mattei, welcome.
I'm very happy to be here.
Professor Mattei is the author of The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. Her book investigates the origins of austerity as an economic policy after the crisis of World War I. Crucially, she argues that austerity is not merely about governments balancing financial budgets. Professor Mattei contends, that austerity policy implemented by all Western governments is a political instrument of repression to prevent any challenge to the prevailing capitalist order. Professor Mattei, can you explain how austerity is used as a form of political control?
Austerity is used as a form of political control in many ways because austerity is a trinity of policies, and it has to do with fiscal policies, how the state spends and what taxes the state imposes on people, namely the state spending away from the people, taking away resources from public benefits, housing, school, healthcare, and so on, and instead deciding to spend potentially on war efforts or just paying back the creditors, which again is money that is shifted away from the working class majority in favor of those who make money out of profits or rent. But fiscal austerity is also about regressive taxation. So it's about imposing greater burden of taxes on the majority of us, while fundamentally detaxing real wealth, cutting corporate profits, while consumption taxes and other forms of indirect taxation increases. So then it's about monetary austerity, increases in interest rates, and finally fiscal austerity, about privatizations, labor deregulation, direct attacks on unions, all that has to do with the labor sector. So already by me defining this trinity, what I call the austerity trinity, we see that all of this trinity is meant to reinforce the element of market compulsion that traps our lives. How? Well, if you take away resources, for example, social resources from the people, this means that you are increasing market dependence, meaning that we need very simply put, we need more money in our pockets in order to be able to purchase what before we gained as rights as citizens, right? Now we need to pay for education. We need to pay to get cured decently. Housing, for example, you need to pay rents if you don't have public housing, and so on and so forth. So this means that we need more money in our pocket. We depend more on the market for our survival. And this increases our precariousness as workers, as people, and ultimately means that it disempowers us from actually being able to think about alternatives that come out of the fact that we do have the resources to meet, organize, spend time outside of work to think collectively, right? So this is one example. Of course, monetary austerity, what we're seeing right now in the form of increases in interest rates, also has the force of disempowering us because it is leading to greater unemployment numbers. So the labor markets are getting worse for workers, which means that competition is going to increase amongst the workers. And this will lead us to have to accept lower wages and once more a situation of precariousness, of insecurity that serves to politically tame us into accepting the status quo. Of course, the same is the case for industrial austerity, because if you privatize, you increase competitions among workers in the private sector. If you defeat union organization, of course, this defeats the idea of collective action in favor of a fundamental individualization of our society. So clearly, this is a political project that is very successful in making sure that societies accept capitalism as the only system possible because we don't have the force to think, imagine a different future. And I would like to conclude to say that austerity is not just state-run policies in the form of the trinity. It's also about the models backing these policies, the theory that justifies this sort of extractive and classist state interventions, which also disempowers us because it has us thinking that the problem is us and not the system at large. So it gives you a sense that actually, if you are poor, you deserve it. Those at the top are there because they are better than us, and ultimately serves to really curtail the political imagination about how we could be organizing society.
So could it be said, Professor Mattei, that austerity is just a euphemism for class war and dictatorship by a minority, dictatorship by billionaires, the oligarchy? Would that be, is that a fair?
I would definitely say so. I would say it's clearly a case of one-sided class warfare, in which, though, we need to keep in mind that the state is deeply implicated. Austerity is not about less state, more market. It's about the state actively intervening to protect, to encase, and to foster the title of my book, The Capital Order, which is the fact that we all have to accept our condition as precarious, low-paid wage workers in order for the capitalist economy to thrive. So definitely, and I would say that it is, though cloaked, this class warfare is cloaked under a sophisticated, very technical economic theory jargon that has us think that we are not good enough to understand the models of the experts. And thus, it is a way to obscure and to ultimately confuse us in actually seeing this class warfare. So it's hidden, right? It's hidden by the power of technocracy.
I mean, I would guess, I would presume you would endorse a socialist alternative as a challenge to the existing capitalist order. You would see that as a viable alternative.
I would. I think the word socialism, unfortunately, has been the victim of austerity. Austerity's success is about giving us the message there is no alternative, right? And in dismissing all of the other possibilities of organizing production and distribution within society as fundamental madness, irrationality, or just authoritarianism or whatever. So I do think that we need to qualify the word socialism. I think it is a word that is attracting many people, but it's also a word that has been misused. The type of alternatives that I describe in the first part of this book are, I think, that happened 100 years ago. 1919 was the year in which we can say all different varieties of socialist experiments were being put into practice. But these socialist experiments, I would prefer to call post-capitalist experiments that rotate around the idea of economic democracy. So this is very important because now we associate socialism with the idea of kind of state-led economic system in which the state ultimately oppresses the people and imposes vertical relations of production. This is not really the socialism that socialist thinkers were thinking about. And if you take seriously the experiments after the First World War that I think can speak to us still today, and that's why I would urge people to look at, for example, what was happening in the council movement of Antonio Gramsci, who was one of the leaders in Turin in 1919. And what you see is that the factory councils and the peasant councils were all about putting democracy at the center of how you understand collectively organizing production distribution. So the idea that you would abolish wage relations, abolish private property of the means of production, not in favor of an authoritarian state, as it's like, we can depict socialism, but socialism in the sense of putting the producer, the human, at the center of this collective enterprise that was fully democratic. For me, this is the type of socialism that I espouse, and I think has a lot of vitality still today, and a lot of interesting lessons to teach us still.
Well, thank you, Professor. I'm just getting back to critiquing austerity, the concept, the policy. It could be said that austerity is the other side of the coin to war in the capitalist system. I mean, governments across the Western world are imposing massive austerity programs on their public, like really vicious programs. We see in France where retirement age is being raised, and people are being effectively, done out of millions of euros worth of kind of a public welfare. Other forms of austerity, right across the board, right across Western countries. Yet at the same time, in the last year, the United States and the European Union governments have given something like over $100 billion of military aid to Ukraine to fight a proxy war against Russia. So on one hand, they're arguing that this is imperative that we have these austerity cuts. Yet on the other hand, they quite willingly, glibly throw away billions of dollars worth of, military aid. So in your view, austerity is the other side of war.
Yes, absolutely. Austerity and military expenditures are not in opposition with one another. That's why we shouldn't think about austerity just as being about cuts in the budget in general. Austerity is about specifically shifting resources away from the people and making sure that the resources for the profit motive of the large, for example, military industrial complex, which is, by the way the capitalist economy is being boosted at the moment, is by state intervening to foster the enormous amount of profits of the military industrial complex. So absolutely, what we see is that the ideology of national opposition, right? We're all Americans against Russia. We're all Americans against China. We are all the West against the barbarians. This is a wonderful way in which the capitalist state hides, once more, mystifies what is really going on, which is the fact that there is a domestic and transnational warfare going on against the majority of the working people, right? So it's always, this has been the history of capitalism. This is just the exposure of what the capitalist logic is about. Geopolitical tensions are there not only to, of course, boost the profits of the few, but also because it really does serve to divert attention of people away from what is actually happening against the citizens of the countries in the first place. Ukraine is imposing massive austerity on its population, also fostered by economic experts, mainstream experts, who have actually written a lot of depositions for the Ukrainian government saying, now that you have very little money, it's the right moment to privatize, to outsource all of your social infrastructure. And Zelensky was able to pass last August, thanks to the war emergency, this massive deregulation of labor and curtailment fundamentally of this national bargaining clauses that are very, very much defeating of the Ukrainian working class. And the same we're seeing in Italy, in my country. It's the best moment while Meloni is sending arms to NATO and we're spending a lot of our money to NATO. We are cutting all of the benefits on the poor and increasing regressive taxation. Macron is another typical example. So we clearly see how, instead of talking about war in terms of geopolitical units, we should take back the class lens and realize that this war is one aspect of something that deeply affects us directly, which is fundamentally this economic warfare that hits us all.
Right, Professor. Your book, the Capital Order, traces austerity back to the origins of fascism in Europe, after the First World War, in particular Italy and Britain. I mean, would you say today that today's Western governments conform to a form of fascism, given what you're saying about the autocratic imposition of this, anti-democratic and horrible anti-human sort of like austerity policy? Is that so? We're living under fascism.
So this is where I think it's very important for me to have used serious archival resources and direct scholarly research, because the book looks at the very nature of the founding father of fascism, which is Benito Mussolini. So for me, this is important because we don't want to overuse the word fascism, and we don't want to end up, being dismissed as superficial, using big words for nothing. But actually, what is very scary for us today is to see that if you look at what fascism was all about in the 1920s in Italy, and no one can deny that that is real existing fascism under Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was all about austerity in the 1920s, and actually his power was strengthened. He gained international recognition by the liberal democratic elite exactly because, as Montagu Norman of the Bank of England put it in 27, he was the right man. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment. Fascism has surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. Mussolini was the one who was capable of curtailing all of these democratic alternatives to capitalism that had emerged during the 1919-1920. And he did it via austerity. He privatized, he cut social expenditures, he increased regressive taxation, defeated unions, and so on and so forth. So what you see here is that what Mussolini, a fascist country, was doing was not only acclaimed by the economic international establishment as the correct recipe for economic recovery, it was also what was happening in the liberal democracies as well. So that's why my work is a comparison between the British and the Italian case, exactly to show how liberal democracies were implementing the same type of treatment of their citizens, having the workers sacrifice in the name of the supposed good of the whole. So in this sense, I do think that this historical case study helps us blur the boundaries between supposed democracies and authoritarian regimes. And it can then have us think about what is happening today and asking ourselves, well, what Macron is doing right now, can it really be compatible with a democracy that is substantial? Or is this ultimately form of technocratic authoritarianism much more similar than what you would think to historical cases of fascist dictatorship? So it does help, I think, the current citizen to blur the boundaries, to think critically about our let's say our comforting idea that we do live in a democracy and that fascism is gone forever. Actually, what you see is that Mussolini was a dictator, but he was considered the best policymaker exactly because he was doing the efficient reforms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a scary thought, really. What you're saying there, that about the reality of what we're living under. When you look at the French government, Macron pushing through horrible reforms against people's interests without any parliamentary oversight or mandate. Two more questions, Professor Mattei, and thank you very much for your time again. You've been very generous in sharing your great knowledge and understanding of history. So, given the financial and banking crisis in the United States currently, being manifest, Do you see anything unique about the moment in economic history right now that could provide an opportunity for a significant system change out of
Thank you.
this turmoil?
Thank you. I am very hopeful and optimistic because I think the justification for the current status quo are crumbling, and the economic violence is being overtly wielded against the people in a way that even if, you know, the media talks about the war against Russia and tries again to take away the attention from what's really happening at the level of the domestic economy, people are living the economic compulsion on their skins. And this is clear right now with what the Fed is doing in the United States by increasing interest rates, another very important element of austerity, which is indeed, the data shows, being very successful in cooling down the labor market, which means, in very concrete terms, increasing the precariousness of workers by slowly increasing unemployment. And so this thing about the fact that clearly an institution like the Fed is attacking directly the workers, because workers have been unionizing in the United States in this historical moment much more, especially in the service sector. People have actually been demanding for higher wages. So I do think that right now we're in a moment in which the antagonism of these institutions that supposedly should represent the interest of the whole is very obviously actually playing a game of oppression, and people are seeing this. So, and to go back to what we were saying a minute ago, is that, you know, while Mussolini was using the strong hand of the state, what liberal democracies like to do is use the agency of these institutions that are shielded from the general public thanks to these independent mandates. This central bank independence is a big way in which oppressive economic policies are normalized in societies, because, you know, ultimately it is in the constitutional framework that the general public has no say over how we decide on monetary issues, which are the most important issues in our economy. So I do think that what I'm saying is that I do think that right now, given how clearly the elite is pushing to defeat all of these demands for a greater standard of living, and how ultimately, even, of course, a democratic president like Biden is not at all able to deliver in any of its supposed promises for social redistribution, is making people more aware of how capitalism ultimately is, in its very logic, a system that produces a majority of losers and a very small minority of winners. And I think this is even more obvious to people living in the south of the globe. I was actually in South Africa for a book tour a couple of weeks ago, and there, the sense of needing to really think about a different way of organizing society is even more obvious, and people are willing to start something with their own agency, start thinking about how can we produce and distribute, gaining back agency, giving back independence from the market that oppresses us. And I do think that there's a lot of space out there to be imaginative and to think outside of the box of the limits of austerity capitalism.
Professor Mattei, thank you very much again. One last question, if you may. Given the use of austerity to silence discontent, how can workers overcome this tactic to effectively counter this fascist economics, as you describe it? How can this austerity dictatorship be overturned?
So, I'm a big supporter of the idea that knowledge, practical knowledge of envisioning alternative foundations for our economy and our society have to be found in the working of people themselves. I am very much against the idea that people above, sitting in their armchairs, intellectuals, professors, bureaucrats, should set an imprint for people. So I am really optimistic of the capacity, the self-organizing capacity, and the production of knowledge that happens within the circles that are mobilizing on the ground. And I think this is one of the most important insights from chapter 4 of the Capital Order, which I'm which I really deeply believing, is the concept of praxis, the idea that theory and action move together. So you can only start thinking creatively and overcoming the traps, the mental traps that austerity has provoked in us, by acting differently, by taking on initiatives, and they can be small initiatives. For example, in the township Kailichi, where I was 2 months ago, they started organizing small pieces of land in which they are producing their own food and finding ways to sew their own clothing, and actually organizing a school in political economy. So you see how you start with something small, and this something small opens up your capacity to think bigger. But this is why, though, you cannot have theory that works on its own. Theory has to come in dialogue with actual action. And the theory that is useful is the theory that brings action forward. And this is, I think, an Gramscian insight that is really, really important. So in all of this, I would like to conclude by saying we can all contribute our part. We all have different roles to play. I contributed my part by writing a book that really tries to politicize austerity in order to show that capital, as the founding social relation of our system, is not eternal, is not natural, is not a given. It's something that has to be constantly protected by the elite. And this is the purpose of austerity, to constantly protect, to stabilize capital as the social relation that grounds our society. Now, if this has to be constantly protected, it means that it can be questioned and actually ultimately overcome by collective counteraction coming from the majority and not from the minority who is in power. So I do think that the first thing to do is to be realistic in the understanding of how capitalism operates. Realize that capitalism is not a system that is eternally reformable. This is why I have problems with a lot of left-leaning thinkers who take on a Keynesian insight by which ultimately capitalism can fit all social reforms because it is ultimately flexible enough to accommodate the good of the whole and the welfare of the people. We need to be very realistic in looking at the history of our economic system to note that austerity is in its DNA, because austerity is necessary, given that our system only works if you constantly shift resources away from the people to a minority to preserve the political oppression that makes it such that we cannot think of a better future for ourselves. So the first step is, let's stop idealizing capitalism, realize that capitalism goes hand in hand with austerity. Thus, we need to really look outside of the box of the economic models and give space to the actual initiatives that are happening all around the world, especially in the global south. There's a lot of initiatives to actually think about how we can completely reverse the way we organize the very foundations of our society, the production of the resources we need to survive, and how we can redistribute it. So the message is, let's be imaginative, and this imagination comes with sturdy historical knowledge combined with active participation on the ground in all the societies we live in. This is really a moment in which we need to, in our role as those who inform the general public, to open at the eyes of people to the constant economic injustices and how we ultimately live in a socialism for the rich. And this is what capitalism is about. And thus we really need to take political action to take back the rights that we all deserve as citizens. I really think, that all we're doing here is very important. And you start with little things, you start getting people to question a little bit of what they usually take for granted. And this is the first mission we have. I'm here and I'm available, and this is why I wrote the book, is to try to get people to think a little. So please follow up with me. I'm happy to do more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great